Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor and I am not providing medical advice. The DIY or do-it-yourself apps discussed in this video include closed-loop algorithms that help automate insulin delivery and monitor blood glucose. They are experimental and not approved by the FDA. This information is provided to assist you in making your own decisions in consultation with your healthcare professionals regarding your own diabetes management. You take full responsibility for building, running, and using these apps and do so at your own risk. What we're going to go over is I'm going to share some ideas, some warnings, and big ideas. And I'm really just going to try to distill it down to the main idea of what I do when we deal with parties and grazing and or multi-stage bigger meals. So you can imagine most of the holiday parties we're used to, Thanksgiving, Christmas, etc., usually are comprised of food being out and you like getting appetizer style plates. And then eventually you have a bigger meal, lunch or dinner, usually a dinner, and then followed by dessert time at the end. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here, but you could shrink this down to just like a dinner with dessert, like a big dinner with dessert, that kind of stuff. I'll try to break that down. I'm going to give you a couple of like variations on it in terms of like how aggressive you want to be. Just realize that what I'm going to describe may sound a little bit bold, I guess, in how we attack it, but then I'm going to give you something more concrete. If you've never done something like this, and I'll give you something that's safer that you can use as a jumping off point for experimenting with bolusing in this way. At the end, you can ask some questions for some context. This is Tessa. Tessa is 12. Tessa eats all the things. She eats a lot of food these days. She hasn't always eaten a ton, but she's definitely picking up the way she eats. This is the context for my handling meals. Tessa's been type 1 since she was 6 or 5.5, and now she's 12. So we've had our fair share of parties and stuff to go through. I focus on, during these parties, trying to minimize disruptions. For everyone else, oftentimes it lands on me. But I'm going to try to give you the idea of let's try to minimize the disruption, even to you if you're the looper. My goal is to not have to wait and pre-bolus while everyone else is eating. We can try to pre-bolus, but not at the expense of waiting to eat while everyone else is eating. We're not going to wait for when it's dessert time. It's dessert time. I may ask Tessa to wait a few minutes, but typically that's not the goal. It's just like when everyone else is transitioning to dessert, that's what we're going to do. No limits on what she eats or how much, as much as we can, and then try to insert some fun. You try to grab something that maybe you wouldn't normally try and bolus for because you're afraid it's going to raise your blood sugar too much, usually in a short amount of time, something fast. One of my tips will be to find something yummy that will raise your blood sugar relatively quickly. And we'll use that as our kind of safety mechanism that eventually you'll get to consuming if you feel like doing so. Think about that as you walk into a party. Let's have a little bit of fun with this rather than a ton of stress. I'd like to keep any blood sugars over the 160, 180 range relatively short, hour or two. Once they get up there, though, it's hard to get down. You guys all know that, I'm sure. A high is much more difficult to manage than a low. So also keep that at the forefront of your mind as you choose to make your bolusing decisions. You're gonna make it a little bigger. There we go. Yeah, we're gonna try. And then the other trick you guys are probably aware of is that staying in range overnight can be a little bit dicey at the end of all this with all the fat and the protein and stuff going on in here. There may be a couple of things in this presentation that I may need to refresh on. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to gloss over some ideas. I'm going to assume you understand the impact around fat and protein. And if you don't, ask questions at the end. I'm happy to explain it. For those of you who've listened to podcast episodes and other YouTube videos I've been in before, and those of you in my class right now are well versed in that. So I'm going to gloss over it. But if you're not sure what I mean by that, just stick around at the end and we'll ask some questions. The idea is you want to stay ahead of your food, right? It's easy for the food to outpace the insulin. Right? Insulin takes about an hour to really get going, and food does not. And it's easier to catch a low and just nudge it back up than it is to deal with the high. But you also need to keep in mind that your body can only process so much food at once. So when you're into these big meals, even though Loop has the taco icon, which people use as the default kind of 3-hour meal, I think you're going to find that it's safer to maybe have the first couple of things in there as maybe a medium if you think it's appropriate. But you're going to want to be generous with the use of your pizza icon, the 5-hour absorption in Loop, because you're going to start probably consuming over the amount your body can process at a fast rate. So it's just going to slow everything down. Even though some of these foods you may encounter may normally raise your blood sugar pretty aggressively by themselves, when you pack it into everything else you're eating, if you're going to be eating probably more than you should, which is kind of the vibe of Thanksgiving, just keep that in mind. So I would say generous use of the pizza icon. especially after the first plate of food, is definitely a good plan. I sometimes take for granted the counting skills we may have acquired. So, if you're not sure, look up a couple of the things you run into. If you don't normally eat sweet potatoes with tons of brown sugar and marshmallows in them, then do a quick search maybe the day before or morning of and get a rough ballpark of what some of these recipes that might give you some macros would be. So at least you're in the ballpark. You're not guessing 10 when it should be 30. But we don't always encounter all these foods. So if you need to brush up on a few of them, then go ahead and do that. The big thing you want to watch for is fat and protein. So in general, I'll just tell you my short guideline is I often do around a third of the fat and protein as carbs. You take fat and protein, you add them up and then divide it by 3. That's the starting place I use for entering carbs that represent the impact of fat and protein later on in loop. You can play around with that. There's different ways to do it. If you're kind of a low carb and you're going to be low carbing through this meal also, then you might do. I tell people when they're just starting out to focus on the fat, maybe do half of the fat. The big thing you need to know is that fat and protein is largely responsible for the rise that what I kind of call the second rise in the meals. The first 3 or 4 hours is largely carbs, and then like from hour around 1.5, 2, all the way out to 6, 7, 8 hours is largely caused by the insulin needs of fat and protein. And then you're going to be eating a lot of things, so it's going to keep stacking on top of each other as you go throughout the night. Loop only understands carbs, so you got to put carbs in. You can't just say fat and protein. Always good to make sure your settings are solid before you walk into Thanksgiving if you can. I've done a few videos on this on Loop and Learn, and I have in my free trainings I've offered it last year or so. I've done a few of those. I talk about checking your basal accuracy with insulin on board overnight, kind of seeing if you're carrying positive IOB overnight and higher than your range, you probably need to up your basal. If you're underneath and with negative IOB all night, then you probably need to lower your basal. So try to dial that in before you get into Thanksgiving. Take a look at your settings. Don't just ignore the graph. Take a second and look at it. If you don't know what you're looking at, if you have the time, you can watch a couple of my longer analysis videos. I have a YouTube channel for Fox and the Loop House, and I have a playlist on my channel I don't have that many videos on my own channel at the moment, but I did make a couple playlists that grabbed handful, 2 or 4, 5, 6 videos from the Loop and Learn videos that I've done in a playlist. So you can find just those couple right away. So you could do a how to analyze loop data if you want. This is probably a good one where I just analyze 2 different people's graphs. So you can get some of the ideas there, or you can listen to the podcast, the Juicebox podcast series, the latest 3 episodes. I'll have that broken down. You don't have time to practice. Sorry, this practice one doesn't apply because Thanksgiving's coming up. I guess unless you're going to make a pre-Thanksgiving version of everything. The thing I want you to pay attention to is what your carb ratio is. So assuming you kind of have a good handle on your meals, carb ratio is good to just have in mind. Are you in the 5s or 6s or 10s or 12s, whoever your looper is? Kind of get a rough sense for what your carb ratio is. Just a good idea to remember, because what I'm going to challenge you with is picking something and adding in extra insulin all the time. We're going to use your carb ratio as that example. Know your carb ratio and try to hopefully your basal's mostly dialed in. And then make sure you're adding extra carbs for fat and protein. So if you don't know how to do that, I would say just round up. Add 5 or 10 carbs to most of the things you're eating, and you'll probably be okay with that pizza icon. You'll be doing pretty well. Usually we kind of do a grazing, appetizer, meal, and dessert. Assess how hungry you are or how hungry your looper is, right? You don't want to walk into it and say, I don't feel so great. So just a quick check on that. I'd say find some fast-acting carbs. So this is the first thing. Tessa likes to do, something like sparkling apple cider. You could do sodas, whatever. Some kind of liquid sugar that you normally would avoid. Go ahead and find some and set it aside. In a cup, in a can, whatever you got. Roughly estimate the size, the number of carbs it is. Write your name on it, whatever you got to do at the party to make sure no one else touches it, and set it aside. This right here is your backup. This is the kind of the safe version of what I normally do. You have some quick carbs on hand that are fun that you don't mind, enjoying, whether that's a small piece of food or dessert that you think is relatively quick, or the juice or some kind of liquid sugar, and just have it there. Let's call it 25 grams of juice. So healthy amount. Quick note before I step into that, just in case you got some adults here. Alcohol can make you go low, so just be careful with that. Juice and stuff is good. Don't find something super slow. Let's not start with the baked desserts. Let's try with something a little faster. So what you're going to do with this is you're going to feel free to keep the amount of insulin needed for that fast-acting sugar extra. Well, so what I mean by that is you're going to, let's say you get the appetizer plate of food, and let's call it 15 grams because it's small. A little grazing at the beginning of the party. You're gonna put in the 15. Loop's gonna recommend some insulin. Great. Whatever Loop recommends, do more. And what I mean by more is you could do up to very easily, and even more than this if you want. But you could do up to the whatever how much insulin it takes to cover that juice, that 25 grams of glucose you're going to have. You're going to end up with a prediction that's going low. So Loop recommends 2 units, and it takes, let's say, 3 units for the juice that you have set aside. And go ahead and bolus 5. Even though Loop only recommends 2, bolus 5. What this does is this is what's called a super bolus, which I just passed. The concept in the super bolus is that you take a certain amount of basal for the next couple of hours, and you just pull it forward and add it to your bolus. In this case, I'm not doing basal. I'm thinking instead you're going to be thinking of it more along the lines of pre-bolusing this juice that you may or may not ever get to, or whatever the fast-acting carbs are that you're perfectly happy to consume because you don't normally get to do that. So that's the idea, is you would then bolus, add more. So Loop's going to say 2, you're going to put in 5, right? You're putting a 3 extra in there. So now you have a low prediction. And that's okay. I know that scares some of you, but you're doing it on purpose. The prediction is basic. All this is really telling you is that Loop says you have too much insulin for the amount of carbs you have entered in the system. But what Loop doesn't know yet is that you're going to keep eating. And you're going to be okay. That's kind of what we do, is you just put in extra insulin. And I'm giving you something to go off of because it scales with your carb ratio. You can find apple cider or soda or whatever, and you can set that aside and know how much insulin that is roughly, and just keep adding that much extra into your boluses. Now, what this looks like in practice, you don't want to always keep adding 3 units to everything because eventually you'll have too much insulin. So what you're going to do is you're going to enter the plate and then put in the extra insulin. You're going to create this low prediction. The next time you enter food, it's going to say, hey, it'll probably say something like, Loop will say, I don't think you need to give any more insulin. Like, great, you're adding another 20 carbs. That's still going to send you low. You don't need an insulin. Recommendation, 0. That's okay. So great, you move on. Now you've avoided having to pre-bolus the first plate because you're like overdosing that first plate, which is awesome. You didn't have to wait. Everyone's happy about that. And then you get to the second plate, the little appetizer plate you got going on, and Loop says you still don't need any insulin. You're good. You've done a good job. You still have too much insulin in your system, probably only by a little bit at this point. So your chances of going low are almost 0. Loop has the basal off. And then you enter, let's say, a third plate, or maybe you go step into dinner time, right? We're stepping into dinner. We're going to put in 60 or 70 carbs. And now all of a sudden, Loop has a bolus recommendation. It's not going low anymore. Now it's like, oh, well, if we add another 60 carbs in here, well, now we need some insulin. And so maybe Loop recommends 5 units, which for some of you is a lot. I know, I'm just picking numbers. The Loop recommends 5 units for this 60. So you had extra insulin before. Now Loop's like, cool, you had another 60, then we're good. Like, now you need 5 more units. I would tell you, put another 3 in, or whatever it is we're using for this juice. So make sure if it recommends 5, do 8, right? Just keep pushing it down so we're constantly maintaining kind of a low prediction in Loop. This way you don't have to pre-bolus. You're sort of super bolusing everything, keeping lots of insulin flowing. And if you start creeping up too high, you can throw a couple more units at it. Not a big deal. You got the juice set aside. Everything's fine. You know you're eating soon. Not a big deal. You keep this going and basically you're just throwing in insulin and letting Loop keep track of how many carbs you add in and do you have enough to cover all the insulin. And every time you get back to some kind of bolus recommendation, you have to decide, is this time to add the extra insulin, in the food I have, the juice I have set aside? Do I kind of add the extra insulin in? Or are we nearing the end of the night now? We're getting to like dessert phase, for example, and I'm winding down, stomach's full, got to unbutton the pants, right? Then you might start just taking the recommendation, or maybe just doing a little bit extra because you still haven't gotten to the juice yet. So maybe you just do like half of what you need for the juice. And you start dialing it back and start to watch things settle down. And then if you need the juice, you need the juice. If you're starting to drift down and you want the juice anyways, you know, you like, especially your kids, you've said you can have apple cider and you haven't gotten to it yet. And go ahead and when you get near the end of the night and you get to that last bolus that needs a recommendation, go ahead and throw in the extra couple units, maybe like I said, all of it or half of it, whatever, some portion of it. And then when you're ready to let them have it, and you enter it, and it'll probably give you a small recommendation, and you bolus it, and they can drink it. And hopefully, they got plenty of insulin to keep them down. And you might be a short-lived kind of up and down at best, but you should be good to go. So we're just going to blanket insulin in the whole time, but I'm trying to give you a place, an anchor to keep it sane. For Tessa, I do set aside the juice thing, but I'm doing way more than the insulin usually required for that juice because Tessa uses all the insulin. Like just all, she just drink it. It's crazy. These days, I just got to keep pouring it on. But I do have to assess what kind of mood Tessa's in for eating. Sometimes she doesn't eat that much, but usually she's eating all the things. So I will ask her ahead of time, like, hey, what are the 2 things you want? What's the dessert you want to make sure you have? And let's like set that aside so people don't go snake the one she wants. And then what's the like fast acting something, and we'll set that aside. Now she's got those 2 items, and we bolus ahead, just like I was talking about, based on what she's got handy there. Now she pivots and wants to do something else, that's fine, but at least we have those set aside. We're not going to run out of sugary foods or drink, in a situation where now she's got to either take tabs, which she won't love. Now we've taken the fun out of it because you're treating with the stuff you usually treat with, right? That's not exciting anymore. So that's the idea. Let me show you a quick video of what I'm talking about. I tried to illustrate this on Tessa's phone while I had it because my test phone I have doesn't let me do one of these other tricks. So the last trick I'm going to show you is the same exact thing I was telling you, but it's for those of you that use a lot of insulin. So we want to make sure that the pod site, the pump site, doesn't crash out on you, doesn't leak because you've overloaded with insulin. What you need to remember is that what we're doing when we're delivering insulin in a pump is we're pushing fluid, insulin, underneath the skin where it doesn't really belong and letting it soak in. So if you continue to just shove liquid underneath your skin, eventually it's going to like get too high a pressure and it might push back. And that's how you kind of get insulin coming back out of the pump site. So to avoid that, we want to put an insulin at a rate where it can kind of go in and soak in and go in and soak in and not shove in a bunch. Some people don't like putting any more than 5 units in at once. I would say that's a very good idea. But in general, I've heard and experienced kind of that 10 to 15 unit mark where you don't really want to bolus bigger than that too many times if you can avoid it. Tessa's max bolus is 12. I would prefer it be 10, but she just needs to use more insulin more often, and I don't love not putting it all in. A little bit of a tough balance. So here's a trick for those of you that have teenagers or yourself if you're using a lot of insulin, or if you're worried about your pump site going out. I'll show you this take on what we're talking about. So what we have here is, this is Tessa's phone, and I'm just like editing and changing stuff before bed one night. If we enter carbs, which you have here, or I guess it will in a second. I think I add carbs here. So we enter 30 grams. It gives us a 6.9 unit bolus recommendation. I'll back that up. That's all well and good. So let's say whatever I'm entering requires roughly 7 units. What I'll do instead at the beginning, especially the beginning and maybe at dinner time when we check in during the day, depending on how the meal's going, is instead of dosing the entire 7 units, I'm going to go into the pod section. I tapped on the pod icon. Those of you who don't know the shortcut, I guess I should slow down. So I tapped on this section up here in loop, the pod icon, the pump area. And we're going to go to set temporary basal rate. We're going to set a manual basal rate in loop. If you didn't know you could do this, it's pretty cool. What it does is it puts the system into open loop, running a temp basal that you say. So what that also means, just heads up, it means that loop can't turn the basal off if you start going low. So this is a slightly risky move, not really with all the food we're going to eat. So I'm going to crank Tessa's temporary basal rate up to the highest that loop allows. And there's a restriction, a calculation. It's based on your current basal rates. You can only go so high on the max basal rate. So I'm not showing it here, but there's a delivery limits section inside the loop settings that dictates the maximum temporary basal rate you have access to. If I were you, I would go in there and turn it up as high as loop allows. I think the restriction's a little bit conservative, so I don't mind saying that. Turn the max to basal rate inside your loop settings, delivery limit, and just crank it all the way up. Then you come in here and you can set a manual temp basal as high as it allows, or you can pick something smaller, kind of up to you. But for us, I go as high as it allows, which is 12 units an hour. And I'll either do a half hour or an hour, either way. I think in this example, I do an hour. Is that right? Yeah, an hour. All right, so what that's going to do, Tessa's basal rates are around a unit an hour. So for simple math, this is going to deliver about 11 units extra over the next hour, right? She needs a unit just for her basal, so then the remainder of that is 11 units an hour. So it'll deliver 11 units dripped slowly over the course of an hour in loop, all right? And loop knows that. So that's the cool part, is the math is done in loop. So now you can see, hey, you're going to go low because it's giving 11 extra units. And then when I go into enter carbs, it's going to, in this case, not give a recommendation because it's like, okay, if we add the carbs in, you're going to go up. But this is still extra insulin. 11 units is still more than needed for the 30 I gave here as an example. And so you're still going to go low. What's cool about that is that Loop knows you're getting the insulin from the temp basal. So what you can do is you can throw it on, and then you go enter carbs, and maybe it'll give you a smaller bolus or maybe a no bolus recommendation. That's up to you. If this was your very first plate and you weren't pre-bolusing, then I would go ahead and throw in a few units of bolus too. Just bolus a couple units to get it in faster. But what's cool about this is Loop knows about this insulin too. So it's not going to recommend dangerously high amounts of boluses as you keep adding this in. So what this does is this might allow us to get 11 units in slowly over an hour, but also bolus another probably 15 to 20 units over that same hour in boluses. So at least it's getting in slowly and has a chance to soak in under the skin, hopefully without blowing out the pod site. So using the manual temp basal you might just want to try half an hour would be fine, just so it's kind of short-lived, but it does let you do that. So in the example of a half hour is probably a better one now that I'm thinking about it, because it would give roughly 5 units or so. And most of Tessa's recommendations would probably require more than that. So you would have seen a recommendation of like a unit or two in addition to the manual temp basal we have running. We would do this at the beginning of the party, and then I would definitely do it like when we go to enter dinner, as I would turn the temp basal up for at least a half an hour and then bolus the difference. So that way we're not just shoving too much insulin into the pod site. If I see Tessa rise, over 150 with any kind of speed or 160, I might throw a couple extra units on here and there very generously over the course of the party. But that's basically it. Is you can use the carrot button, little orange arrows, and manually bolus. For those of you that are the type 1 themselves or the parents, either way, if there's a watch paired to that phone, the looping phone, then you as the type 1 obviously can wear it, and you can just toss in extra boluses real quickly every time you kind of think, oh, I'm probably going to get a plate here in a little bit. Hit the bolus button, deliver. And then when you get around to getting to it, pump in the carbs, and then you kind of see if you still need a bolus recommendation. Let Loop do the math for you. Let it turn off the basal and give you the boluses and track. If you've put in enough carbs to catch up with all the insulin you're given, let Loop do all the math. Let it do all the thinking for you. If you got a kiddo wearing and they have a watch paired to their phone, I would take it from them and wear it and put it on your wrist. I usually put Tessa's on my right wrist when we're in a situation like that. And that way I can just easily toss in boluses. I like it easier than using the caregiver app or Loop Follow or whatever. It's just easier for me. And we did that before remote existed. So I guess I'm old school in that way. But it's helpful. Tessa's a teenager now. She wants to keep her watch most of the time, but that's what we do. All right. Any questions about the strategy? The big picture is just put in too much insulin and then catch up by entering the carbs and let Loop do that math for you. And that way you don't have to pre-bolus as much, if at all, and you don't have to worry about how much did we give? And then I used to do this when Tessa was on MDI. Real quick example would be when we would have life group, our church, we'd meet with a group of people. We'd have potlucks every Tuesday when she was first diagnosed. And so we would just like, okay, Tessa, walk through. What do you want to eat? And then also tell us what you want for dessert. And then we would inject for dinner and dessert just because she didn't want to have a second shot. But it ended up working out well because we didn't pre-bolus and we'd kind of have to catch the drop of the tail end of the meal with dessert anyways. So it was really good timing. So that's kind of where we got the initial idea. So when you start adding in the appetizer part of the meal, and sometimes Thanksgiving and Christmas sort of spread out the pacing between all the eating sessions, it's a little trickier, but that's with Loop now, we can do the math. I don't have to say, well, we bolus this much and we got to make sure we eat this much. You can just throw in the insulin first. I kind of ask questions later. Start adding the carbs in and watch the prediction kind of come back up. And I just say reserve something that you or your kid would not mind consuming to catch a low. And then you can enter those carbs too. Don't just drink the apple cider and then not enter it. Like this is planned food, put it in, no big deal. And then everyone's happy that you had to sort of treat with something fun, and then like you're good for the rest of the night. Uses a little amount of insulin, basal over 24 hours, under 5 units. Yes, it would. You would mostly scale it. That's why I suggest you would scale it. The super bolus method is a good method if you want to be conservative. And so you could take your basal rate, let's say it's half a unit an hour or so, then you could double or triple or quadruple that. If you can imagine how long the food you're going to eat is going to impact you, probably 4 hours at the start of a Thanksgiving meal, then what's 4 hours of basal for you? If in a half a unit an hour situation, it's only 2 units. So you could just throw in an extra 2 units. And then when you start catching up to where Loop is recommending a bolus again, you could just throw on another 2 units. That's the probably safer approach. is, and then as you get near the end of the night, you start backing that off. But I prefer to scale it to give people a place to start by scaling it to 20 or 30 grams of some kind of fun, fast acting glucose, usually liquid, at a party that you wouldn't normally enjoy, but you thought, oh, that would be fun. That scales up differently because people with low basal rates may still need a fair amount for their meals. So I like scaling it off of something you can already, like, you can catch it with, and then enter it on purpose. So it's just, in my mind, it's always like pre-bolusing that food you have set aside. And then if you don't get to it, then that's fine. But if you do, then also that's fine. That's kind of how I would approach it. So the conservative one is just a couple hours of basal, but for Tessa, that's only 4 units. But if I take 30 grams of juice, that for Tessa is 6+ units. So I throw in, I like to scale off of the food. If you don't have anything you want to catch it with, so this would work for any meal, not just a holiday meal. You could just do a couple hours of basal. How long you think that food is going to impact your blood sugar? I would just use basal. That's the conservative way to go. But we're talking big meals. Let's have fun with it. Pick something you want to have an excuse to have, then add that on top of your boluses and you'll be okay. It should scale then based on your insulin needs. If your carb ratios are 15-1 instead of Tessa's 5-1, it should scale, right? You set aside 30 grams of juice, now you're only 2 units. Similar to my example from earlier. It'll scale. It just, whether you use a little bit or a lot, it will help. So how aggressive you get is kind of based on past experience and the kind of food you're eating. Good question. There aren't a lot of boundaries I put on Tessa around diabetes management. Well, one of them is do not eat from a bag. Please put it on the plate and at least eyeball it if you're not going to count it. So don't be grazing out of a bag. Don't let your kids do it if they're the loopers. I recommend if you're the adult, don't do it. Don't go just walking around and grab handfuls of stuff out of the bag and start eating. Dump it on a plate and at a minimum eyeball it, right? At least have some sense of it. And otherwise you're going to undercount it because you'll just keep going back and eating more. And those are Tessa's. I wouldn't say call them disasters, but like her biggest highs are just like sitting around with some friends lately and munching on stuff out of a bag. And I go, well, how much did you have? And you go, I don't know. And like you're sharing it with someone, so you really don't know how much you ate. That's not usually fantastic. So yeah, plate it. I tell her, you can eat whatever the heck you want. Just plate that sucker and then we'll take a guess. Please don't eat from a bag. You guys join me for another one of these when I send them out. And you guys have a happy Thanksgiving. Feel free to reach out on social media if you need anything at all, or if you want to get a free consult, you can just send me a message and I'll send it to you. Have a good night, everybody.